Williams Carter stood inside the grand entrance of his family's old mansion in Savannah, Georgia, when Jenna Harris arrived carrying a small handbag. He expected a maid applicant. His grandfather needed someone to help around the house, and Jenna looked quiet, nervous, and completely ordinary. Williams had no idea how wrong he was. The mansion had belonged to the Carter family for nearly a century. Its tall windows, wooden staircase, and faded portraits reflected generations of wealth. But behind its impressive walls lived Williams's grandfather, Edward Carter, an elderly man whose memory had begun disappearing. Williams had returned home to care for him after years away. When Jenna introduced herself, Williams barely looked up from his paperwork. "You're here about the household position?" he asked. Jenna nodded. "Yes, sir." Williams pointed toward the sitting room. "My grandfather needs someone patient. He gets confused easily." Jenna smiled politely and said, "I understand." She didn't correct his assumption about why she was there. Edward entered slowly, holding an old wooden cane. The moment he saw Jenna, he stopped. His tired eyes widened with recognition, although Williams immediately assumed his grandfather was confused again. "You came back," Edward whispered. Jenna's expression changed. She stepped forward and gently took his hand. "I promised I would someday." Williams stared at them. "Grandpa, have you met her before?" Edward smiled faintly. "Not exactly." Jenna looked uncomfortable. She explained that years earlier, her grandmother had worked at the mansion as a housekeeper. Jenna had spent summers there as a child, secretly playing the piano in the music room whenever Edward allowed her. Williams was stunned. He had never heard that story. His grandfather rarely spoke about the past anymore. Jenna explained that her grandmother had passed away several years earlier, leaving Jenna a small box containing letters, photographs, and a strange old key. She had recently discovered that the key belonged to something inside the Carter mansion. That evening, Jenna followed Edward to the old music room. Dust covered the furniture, but an antique piano still stood against the wall. Edward pointed toward a cabinet and whispered, "Your grandmother knew the truth." Jenna opened it using the key she carried. Inside was an old music box decorated with tiny silver flowers and a faded family crest. Williams watched as Jenna carefully lifted the music box. When she opened it, a familiar melody filled the room. Edward immediately began crying. He remembered the song. "Your grandmother used to play this for me," he said. "She knew my mother. She knew everything." Jenna looked at Williams, realizing the music box was connected to a forgotten chapter of his family's history. Later, Edward showed them an old photograph. It pictured his younger self, standing beside Jenna's grandmother outside the mansion. Williams recognized something unexpected in the photograph, a woman standing beside Edward's father. Edward explained that she had been his father's closest friend and had helped save the family business during a financial crisis decades earlier. Jenna then revealed why she had really come. She wasn't looking for a maid's job. She had been researching her grandmother's life and discovered letters suggesting that the Carter family had once promised to preserve a small community music program. Her grandmother had spent years protecting that promise, but the program had eventually disappeared. Williams became defensive. "Are you saying my family stole something?" Jenna shook her head. "No, I'm saying someone forgot." She handed him the letters. They revealed that Edward's father had promised to donate part of the mansion's unused property to create a music school for local children who couldn't afford lessons. Edward covered his face with his hands. His memory was fading, but the promise suddenly returned to him. "I remember now," he whispered. "I was supposed to finish what my father started." Williams looked around the mansion and realized how much of his family's history had been buried beneath wealth, pride, and years of silence. The following morning, Williams apologized to Jenna. "I treated you like someone who came here to clean our floors." Jenna smiled. "That's what you thought I was." Williams lowered his eyes. "I should have asked who you were before deciding what you were worth." Jenna appreciated the apology, but she wasn't interested in revenge. She wanted Edward's promise fulfilled. Together, they began restoring the abandoned music room. Williams sold several unused luxury items from the mansion to fund repairs. Jenna contacted local teachers and musicians. Edward donated the property. Slowly, the forgotten mansion transformed from a symbol of old wealth into a place filled with children's laughter and piano music. As weeks passed, Williams and Jenna grew closer. They spent long evenings working together, sometimes arguing over paint colors or budgets, then laughing about their disagreements. Williams discovered that Jenna was intelligent, compassionate, and fiercely determined. Jenna discovered that beneath Williams's serious personality was a man who genuinely wanted to become better. One afternoon, Edward watched them from his wheelchair as children practiced music in the restored room. His memory had good days and bad days, but that day he remembered everything. He called Williams and Jenna over and placed the old music box between them. "This house was never the inheritance," he said softly. "This is." Months later, the music school officially opened. Families from across Savannah attended the ceremony. Jenna's grandmother's photograph was placed beside the entrance, honoring the woman whose forgotten promise had brought everything back to life. Williams stood beside Jenna, holding her hand, while Edward watched proudly from the front row. After the ceremony, Williams asked Jenna to stay behind. He led her into the music room and opened the old music box. The familiar melody began playing. "When you first came here," he said, "I thought you wanted a job." Jenna laughed. "And now?" Williams smiled. "Now I can't imagine this house without you." Jenna looked around at the children, the restored piano, and the elderly man who had welcomed her back into a forgotten part of his life. She realized she hadn't inherited money, property, or a family name. She had found something much more valuable: people who had become home. And Williams finally understood that the greatest inheritance wasn't the mansion, the land, or the Carter fortune. It was the chance to repair what previous generations had forgotten, to welcome unexpected people into your life, and to discover that sometimes the person you almost overlook becomes the person who changes everything.